Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, population and urbanization. I am obsessed with demography, probably because I love statistics. So anything that has to do with population studies, looking at vital statistics, comparing countries is right up my alley because it's also really helpful for me as like a college professor to be able to quote statistics like 35% of people graduate college, 15% of them get a master's degree, only 1% of people get a PhD, but where do these statistics come from? Demographic studies, population studies, and then urbanization is fascinating. The growth of cities, the development of humanity, the advancement of people, the building, the concrete, the masses, something I just love to study. So I don't know if you guys have a passion for cities. I love cities. I love to go to a city and wander around, just get lost and look at everything. And it's a huge mass and just something that I'm very passionate about. So I love, but urbanization is more than just studying the people. It's about the structure, it's about the building and the infrastructure and all the things that it takes, the plumbing, the electric lines, the concrete, the heat, it's a wonderful subject. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Okay. So demography, simply defined, is the study of population. For example, we can look at sizes, like how many people are there in the United States? How many people are there in the state of Ohio? How many people are there in each county? Okay, and then how do we divide that up, and decide who gets to vote and things along those lines? Because again, if you're going to draw voting lines, you need to understand demography so you know how many people live in each county, so then you can put that all together. Again, it's really cool stuff, and I love the numbers. They're so fun. But you can also look at composition, like the age range of people. So, for example, the birth rate in China is declining. So right now they're going to experience a reduction in the birth rate, but they're going to have a very large older population compared to a younger population. So they're really worried about the economic effects of that, for example. So now China is kind of changing its stance on, having babies and saying, okay, we need to have babies. And this is another reason for immigration. We should be encouraging it because the declining birth rate is going to reduce the amount of workers in the United States. Therefore, we need to create immigration so that we can grow our economy. Because if we're not growing our economy, then our economy is going to go down. So immigration increases gross domestic product, which increases the overall economy. And so immigration does nothing but good things for the United States, which is why it's sad to see so much prejudice and discrimination really getting in the way of, what should be economic immigration policy. Looking at sex, males, females, intersex distribution. Looking at race, like neighborhoods. Is the world still segregated? And you'll find that it is. If you start doing population studies of neighborhoods where people that are white, African American, Asian, Jewish, Muslim, you tend to see this, okay? Studying ethnic backgrounds. That's what I'm saying with the neighborhoods. You can really see it. But then just the number of ethnicities in general. Okay. And then diverse religions. How many people are going with what? These are just examples of stuff that we can study. We're going to be looking at the distribution of populations across, cities and states. Like why is New York and Los Angeles and Chicago have the most people? Okay, and then how does that spread out from the capital on outward, for example? So we're going to be looking at the distribution of people. We're going to be thinking about with demography migration patterns, looking at things over the decades and over the centuries, for example. And so when you look at immigration patterns in the United States, immigration started out first as Europeans, and then they started bringing over slaves, and then people of little bit started to trickle in that were Jewish and Muslim, and and then Asians started to come in, and then about the 1850s and 60s, you had this mass influx of Asians, which then the United States creates this anti-Asian policy with the Chinese Exclusion Act, trying to discriminate against Asians, which we stripped their citizenship during then. So then there was no Asians coming between 1880s and the 1930s. But then during that time, you had a lot of Europeans coming over. So then the Irish all came over. And so then we were prejudiced against the Irish because they were Catholic. And then you started to see this influx of Italians coming over and people from Poland and people from Germany because we weren't letting the Asians come over. Okay. And then we open up the doors again to Asian and then Latin American immigration. So after the 1930s, you see less Eastern Europeans coming over, and then you start to see Asians coming over along with Latinos, and it's been that way ever since. And again, this is just looking at a couple centuries of migration patterns in the United States, but this is fascinating stuff. And then demography will get specific. We give you all the specific numbers of how many people came and how many people are here, and that's what you do. All right. So it also involves looking at health statistics like fertility rates, birth rates, mortality rates. We want to consider all these things because, as we talked about with health and healthcare, for example, why is the fertility rate going down? Why is the birth rate going down? Why is the mortality rate going down in the United States? Because the healthcare system's getting better. We have more access to medicines, and people are living longer, for example. All very interesting. So, what's interesting is our fertility rates going down, our birth rate's going down, but how long we live is going up. Very interesting. So Malthusian theory of population studies basically said that the world was going to be super overpopulated and we were all going to run out of food. Okay, it can be averted by positive actions such as famine, death, disease, or war, which sounds kind of counterintuitive to positive, or preventative population checks, such as limiting fertility, which is what you saw in China. They limited fertility, they didn't let the girls be born, and then now you're seeing that they screwed up there because there's a deficit between men and women of like 40 million, and which then increased rates of violence against women and all these other social problems related to women's rights. But it also created a decline in the birth rate. Okay. So this idea that we're all going to run out of food was popular for a while, but now the idea is to debate this and really ask, is the world actually going to run out of food? I mean, America's pretty big. Really, we could, reform our cities and then, instead of having this urban sprawl where we cut down all the trees, we could stop that, put up some farms instead, and then encourage nature to grow back. And, there's a lot of approaches to how to fix this we're all gonna run out of food, we're all gonna die attitude. So again, we're questioning Malthusian theory. Marxist theory says that that's not true. I mean, basically, it's not that we're gonna run out of food. The only reason people starve is because they're at the mercy of the owners, and so the bourgeoisie is taking advantage of the proletariat by not sharing the wealth. So you have this inequality between rich and poor. So while Marie Antoinette is eating cake, the French peasants are running out of food. And then again, why did the French Revolution start? Well, the French women got hungry and they couldn't feed their babies, and Marie Antoinette was eating cake, so they took the king and queen, beheaded them, and then the French women got their food until another revolution started again. And then 30, 40 years of French Revolution later, you finally end up with this social democracy that they have now. But again, the idea that we're all going to run out of food, he said basically that technology can take care of that just fine as long as you more equally distribute the ability for humans to be creative and have access and rise up the social class ladder. You can compensate for this idea that, we're all going to run out of food. Okay, demographic transition theory says that as societies have moved from high birth and death rates to relatively low birth and death rates, this happened because of technology. Society has evolved. We've gone from agrarian to industrial, and now we're in this post industrial phase in the United States where we don't have any blue collar jobs really left. Most jobs in America are white collar jobs, which is why it's important to get that education to be able to get the job that it requires some kind of a degree to really get access to that job itself. And so again, the jobs in America have changed. The types of jobs for America. Me saying 80% of jobs are white collar jobs, that's demography. I mean, where am I getting these stats from? Well, that's because all the blue collar jobs moved to China and Mexico. And so there's no more factory jobs. There's no more $18 an hour jobs. There's a few in the small towns, but most of the factories up and left. So all that's really left are those managerial roles, unless you want to go into the service industry, serving those who have the money. So again, overtime demography, as in America, the birth rate is declining. Okay, the fertility rate is declining. Women are having less babies. They're waiting later in life to have babies. They're having careers. They're having education. And this is causing, a change in the birth rate, which is why I don't understand, the immigration policy, because we're going to need these people just to be able to keep this economy going. Um, Globally, the population is increasing, but only in a few countries. And again, that's about to cap out, arguably, because of the birth rate in general. So the stages of advancement, you have the pre-industrial. Again, that's, the agrarian, small farms, small towns. Then you have the early industrialization, like the beginning of London, the origin of the city, beginning in 800 AD, 1000 AD, going all the way up. And then you start to see in the 15, 1600s, when we start to get colonial, society becomes super advanced again. And that hadn't really happened since the Roman times, really was the last time that something like that had really happened. Now you see this advanced industrialization and urbanization that's pretty much spread out across the world. And then in countries like the United States, where we don't really produce anything anymore, it's more like a materialistic country living off the capital of other countries where we can, ship products, get, use cheap labor, have it sent back, we then buy that, travels of a t-shirt in the global economy. The cotton comes from the United States, then gets sent to China to get made into a t-shirt. It then gets bought by an American, and then when that t-shirt's done, it gets sent to on a ship over to Africa. I mean, again, Travels of a T-shirt in a Global Economy. It's a pretty good book. If you guys have never seen that or read that book, I like that. You might catch that in history class, but that's just the stuff you got to be thinking about. International migration theories. You have the neoclassical economic approach. This says that migration patterns occur based upon geographic differences in supply and demand for labor. So again, why did Asians come to America? It's because we had a demand for labor, and so they came here looking for a better life and a job for their family. Why do people from Mexico come here? Because the centralized government is not very strong, therefore is susceptible to corruption and elite taking power. So people in Mexico, I doubt that they really just want to like up and leave their homes and their families. They come here because they need a job. And because their country it's not stable enough for them to be able to get that job. It's not like that's why they come. No one wants to leave their home. Okay? New households economics of migration approach. This says that the part that entire families or households play in migration process. Okay, so people actually working together as a team saying we want to up and go. Split labor market theory says that immigrants from low income countries are recruited, okay, because we need the lower class jobs filled. Okay, so they're not just coming because there's a demand for labor, there's a recruitment of labor to fulfill jobs that nobody else wants. And then the world systems theory, again, that continuously comes up. Migration is linked to problems caused by capitalist development. So, as the societies have become more capitalist and those in power consolidate power, the plight of the proletariat becomes worse and they can't compete with the bourgeoisie, then they become at the mercy of the owners and to the extent that they're being exploited. Okay. But again, are people in China being exploited by Americans? Well, they're making, 1/10 what you make. So again, why do you think all the companies left the United States and moved to China to build our stuff? Well, because they can pay for really cheap labor. And so again, is that fair? Should we do something about that? Stuff to think about. Okay, urbanization is simply studying the development of cities. So, urban sociology, that's that. Just studying the development of cities and the migration patterns that are involved in people moving to the cities. And this is a process that's happened since the Industrial Revolution as people have left the farms and migrated to the cities because society has become capitalist. And in a capitalist economy, we sell our labor to get money to go buy goods instead of just, working on a farm and making everything we need there. Okay? So none of us work on a farm. We don't have the means of production. So we have to go sell our labor to those that own the means of production in order to get some capital in order to buy what we need. Okay? So from a functionalist perspective, how has urbanization affected society and what's the purpose of urbanization? What's the purpose of people migrating to the cities? Again, if that's where the jobs are, if that's where the work is, then people migrate to the cities, cities develop, to account for people coming to the cities to fulfill social roles, yada, yada, yada. But it also talks about things like mechanical and organic solidarity. How has that affect social interaction from us leaving the small towns and then everyone up and moving to the cities? Okay, so mechanical solidarity is that small town feel that you kind of lose in the city. But then organic solidarity is the idea that now in modern times we actually depend on more people than you ever thought have. We might have less ties to the people around us and we might only have a few people in our lives, but all of our lives are completely interdependent because again, just for the electricity work, it takes a whole bureaucracy, a bunch of people building the lines, it takes people working at the electric company. I mean, it takes thousands of people just to get the electric to work. Conflict theory would say that cities are arenas for class conflict because the owners, lure and recruit, people off the farm to come work in their shops. And then once they get into the city, they can then take advantage of them because now they're dependent on them for their wages. This enables the owners, the bourgeoisie, to get capital over the proletariat, to get power over the proletariat. And so, as our societies become more capitalized and people have moved to the city and left the farms, we're actually more dependent on our jobs, completely dependent on our jobs, which means we're completely dependent on the owners providing that jobs. And so that's where a lot of the workers' rights movements comes out of is, because 100 years ago, my 5-year-old child would have been working with me in a factory. I would have been a poor Irish, German, Native American immigrant and subjected to the mercy of the worker. And so the workers, for many years had movements which ended up creating overtime pay and 40-hour work weeks and child labor laws. All of this comes out of the working class being at the mercy of the bourgeoisie and then going and changing the laws on a governmental level to make it so the capitalists can completely control our lives, for example. And then exchange theory is this idea that, we sell our labor for things, but we only do it so much as it gets us what we want to do. Once it doesn't get us what we want, we tend to end the relationship and we go on strike, for example. So as long as the owners are paying us what we want, we're all happy. But the second they take two advantages of us, then we can then go on strike because we're no longer willing to exchange our labor for that good because they're not giving us what we need. Symbolic interactionism would focus again on the interdependent interactions of people and how the cities are built by people and how it's filled with people. And again, societies, cities is nothing more than people. Yeah, it's concrete and trees and parks and roads and coffee shops and restaurants and museums, but where did all that come from? I mean, except for the trees, we made it. Okay? So again, interaction between groups in the cities. It also would look at things like neighborhoods and, racial, just, again, why was everything segregated? Well, the schools were integrated in the 1960s, and so all the white people fled out to the suburbs and the high tax districts. And so if you didn't have any money, you couldn't afford to live out in the high tax districts. So then the high tax districts in the suburbs had the good schools, blah, blah, blah. Their kids ended up going here and there. And then again, it's just the, sociologies, there's so much to it, guys. We could talk about it for hours. That's the stuff you'd study in symbolic interactionism. Looking at that, looking at the segregation of neighborhoods, looking at racial and ethnic distribution of people across cities, and why is it like that? And like you go to Chicago, and you can just go from the Polish neighborhood to the Greek neighborhood, and each neighborhood has its own church and its own culture, and you see that a lot. But even in modern times, that segregation is not like it used to. Again, people are way more blended than it was before because, prejudice and discrimination have gone down, despite that it still exists. The ecological model is the idea that the city is organized around a concentric zone, and you have, these areas, these neighborhoods that we're all focused on, and then one neighborhood will come in, a generation will live there, then another generation will come in and flip it, another generation will come in and flip it. And so that's the gentrification process of this turning over the city from generation to generation. Okay. So again, social problems with urbanization. When you had the cities with high risk of poverty, it's not so bad anymore, but you had higher drug use, violence, of course, crime. All of those factors are associated with poverty in cities that have high rates of poverty. But now, like in the United States, you're starting to see some changes where the cities are very expensive. And maybe out here in the suburbs and out in the rural areas, have higher rates of heroin use because there's not a lot of jobs. Their economy is not as good as the city. So which places really have the crime these days is shifting. But like in the 70s and the 80s, I mean, it was the city, inner cities were dangerous. Crime rates were very high in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And they've since gone down since the 90s, and cities have gotten better. But, urbanization did have its own, problems. But then if we go way back, I mean, like London times of Industrial Revolution, I mean, that a lot of our social programs come out of that. How to help the plight of the poor, get them out of the plight of the poor, get them out of the tenement houses, improve the quality of life for the poor. Okay, so that was a big thing with cities because cities used to be rough with disease and poverty. But then again, that's where the whole idea of workers' rights and bringing up that lower class to a better status, they can be middle class, for example, really improve the cities in general and help solve a lot of the social problems associated with urbanization and population increases. Okay, in cities, though, you do have mass immigration. I mean, people tend to immigrate to the cities when they come here first because that's where the jobs are. Okay. You have factors like disability status and your ability to get around the city. You have factors of pollution and poverty. What's better, the suburbs, cities versus rural? Each one has its own way of life. Each one has its own culture. Each one has its own unique set of problems. I mean, so again, what's better for you? What do you like? That's kind of the ultimate question because right now it's a toss up as to what's the safest place. There's so much blending going on. People moved into the cities, but then Corona, maybe if they're going to leave us cities after Corona, I don't know what's about to happen, but the cities got really expensive to live. And the small towns, your housing is going down a lot. So again, you're seeing this change because people had gone into the cities until about the 60s. Then after the 60s, it became all about the suburbs. And then after like 2000, it went back to becoming all about the cities. So again, social problems are associated with race, neighborhood, and social class location because of poverty and things along those lines. Okay, thank you so much.